Chapter 16, Reality. The next night, I was on watch, sitting a short way from the infirmary and reading a book. Oliver had just been shot during an attempted robbery. He was the robber, although he'd actually been forced into it by this jerk named Bill Sykes. Just as I got to the part where Sykes left Oliver for dead, I heard a loud rumbling echoing from the direction of the elevator shafts. I closed the book and stood up. The noise grew as I walked down the tunnel, listening intently. All of a sudden, the rumble gave way to a tremendous thunderclap, and a cloud of dust flew at me, and the force knocking me over. Even as I flew backwards, the thought hit me as hard as the blast. The landers had finished loading the ore and were detonating their bombs. I scrambled to get up and hurried to my digger back to camp. An avalanche of debris chased after me. Chunks of concrete and steel dinged off the rear of my digger. I turned on the radio and yelled, "Landers! Landers!" Then ignited my disruptor and escaped into the rock. We had an emergency plan already drawn up, which was basically to move camp as far away from the cork scraper as possible, then go back and see what had happened. I hoped I was wrong about the bombs, because if that were the case, even moving camp wouldn't save us. Everyone was awake and moving by the time I returned. Elena ordered them to grab their belongings and get into a digger. She'd already loaded Alec into her cockpit. He was sitting there, staring ahead. Maria had gathered Darcy in her cockpit. I gave Darcy a thumbs up. She smiled weakly, but was trembling. We turned on our diggers and sped farther through Tunnel 3 down into the mines. My digger was in the lead, and I alternated 2 more series of left and right turns. Then my light illuminated an enormous excavator sitting idle before a wall of solid rock. I slammed on my brakes. We'd reached the end of the tunnel. I realized with a pang of sadness that this was where the miners had stopped digging the night before the blackout party. There weren't even any lights, emergency or otherwise, this far down. I flicked on my microphone. "Okay, we'll set up the sleeping quarters near the excavator where it's dark. Mandeep and Finn will help set up camp. Elena and Jimmy, once you've dropped off your supplies, we should head back to the core scraper." "Roger," Elena said. "Okay," Jimmy said, but I could hear his quick breathing through the speaker. Half an hour later, we returned to the main entrance to the tunnels. The hall was completely filled with a wall of concrete, steel, glass, and garbage. It was like staring at a giant wall of junk. Small rivulets of dust and rubble trickled down the face. We could get to the other tunnels, but not back to the core scraper. "I don't think this was caused by a bomb," Elena said, pulling her digger close to the wall. "There's no smoke, no fire, no cinders." I pulled up alongside. "So, a cave-in?" She nodded. "A big one. Plus, there's still breathable air here in the tunnels, which means the terraforming equipment is still working. We must have set off a chain reaction when we took out the 28th floor." My insides twisted. This was my fault. "Maybe, but I doubt it. The core scraper had been seriously compromised by the original attack. There had to be a lot of weight pushing down on that floor already. So it was just a matter of time before gravity finished the job." She pointed at the wall. "This forces our hand, you know." There was no way to go back inside the core scraper or the hall. The cave-in had crushed the locker room, the infirmary, the cafeteria, along with the refrigerated food inside. "Why can't we just dig through the rubble and get the stuff?" Jimmy asked, his eyes darting around nervously from us to the wall. "Doesn't work that way," I said. "When you dig in solid rock, the stuff above you isn't loose, so it doesn't fall down. Digging through a cave-in is like digging in sand. It will collapse." Jimmy backed up a few feet. "It doesn't look very stable," he said, watching as small bits of debris came loose and fell to the floor, even sending pings of pebbles off the cockpit roof of my digger. "Let's head back to camp and figure out a plan," Elena said. We backed up and turned around, heading down the tunnels in a line, Jimmy first, me in the rear. I flicked off my radio and yelled, pounding my steering wheel. This was bad. In a flash, the only food we had left were the supplies we'd carried to the camp. We were going to need more food and water, and we'd need them soon. I'd been hoping to put off a real raid until it was absolutely necessary. Now it was. "It's okay, a cave-in, but not an attack," I said as I got out of my digger. Maria gave a huge sigh of relief. "But we'd lost the infirmary and the cafeteria. I have a plan, meeting in 5 minutes." I walked over to Darcy. Can you keep an eye on Alec while we have our meeting? She gave a serious nod. He and I want to make toys out of the used food cans. That was a bit of surprise, a happy one. Cool. Be careful you don't cut yourself. She nodded again and toddled off to the beds. Mandeep gave me a quick smile. Alec still isn't saying much, but he does seem to come alive a bit with Darcy and Finn. That's good. And a little more good news. While you were gone, we took a look around. There's actually a break room just up where the lights still work. No food, but they did hook up some water, and they pre-dug holes for toilets. Great, thanks. Tell everyone we'll use the break room for the meeting. I walked off to see how well the pre-dug toilets worked. A few minutes later, everyone had crowded into the room. Okay, the situation is this, I began. We just lost our main supply of supplies. There was a collective groan. There's good news. There's a place filled with supplies from Earth and food from the farming zones here on Perseus, the main storage depot. Isn't that where the landers are? Maria asked. I nodded. A full-out attack could get us enough food for the rest of the blackout, Elena said. But if we attack, won't they come after us? Maria shuddered as she said this. We don't even have any weapons, Jimmy said, his voice rising. I know. But when we say attack, we don't mean an actual attack. I stared at Elena, hoping my use of we would make her understand the others still weren't ready to think about a fight, let alone have one. What we're talking about here is more of a raid. We think there's a way to get in and out without them knowing we were ever there. How? Elena took a bit of concrete and began to draw a circle surrounded by small dots on the rock wall. This is the layout of the main depot. The circle is the landing pad and the administrative buildings, the hospital, that sort of thing. These dots are storage silos, like the core scraper, but silos are built down into the ground. She drew a large X about a foot away, and this is our location. I drew a line from the X to the circles. We can stay underground, undetected. We drive the diggers right underneath the storage silos, make a hole, climb up, grab some food, and head back out. What if there are landers inside the silo? I jumped in before Elena could say how much she looked forward to that. There won't be. I don't think they know there are survivors, or they don't care about us enough to come after us, so they won't be guarding the food. Which one is the food silo? Elena drew a large circle around the whole image. I've gone with my dad on trips to the depots. The ones near the landing pad hold all the ore. The food storage is kept away from those to prevent contamination, but I've never actually been to the actual food silo. Pavel snorted. Let me get this straight. We don't even know where to look? Not true, I said, sensing a brewing argument. The landers have to eat. They have a large crew. We all saw that. So they have to feed them, and there's no way their ship is giving up storage space for food they can steal here. Elena nodded. So we monitor their movements around mealtimes and see where they go on a regular basis. How the heck do we do that? Jimmy asked. All eyes turned to me. Elena and I sat in our diggers. We were the guinea pigs in a way. If this raid worked, it would be the template for all future raids. It was a risky plan. I couldn't see Elena through the rock, but I knew she sat exactly 5 feet to my left. Our radio receivers were on, but our microphones were off. The landers were only a few feet away, traversing the ground right above us. The sensors in our diggers could pick up the vibrations from their vehicles. We'd slowly snuck underneath one of the roads that led to the main loading dock, where we assumed the lander ships was sitting. And we were waiting. There were numerous roads that radioed out from the central landing pad. There'd be lots of heavy traffic above us all day long, the transport vehicles moving ore from storage silos and the processing machines to the ship. We were ignoring that noise, looking for something smaller. We'd been here for most of the day, and a pattern was emerging. An hour or two before each meal, a small vehicle, judging by the smaller vibrations, would set out and return on the road directly above us. It was a couple of hours before dinner, and if the sensors picked up the same vehicle, we were going to follow it. The sensors on my dashboard began flashing. The smaller vehicle was making another trip. Bingo, I said. I turned on my radio and tapped 3 times on the microphone. Elena tapped 2 times back, and restarted her disruptor. We drove straight ahead, staying right underneath the vehicle. It began to slow, and so did we. I watched the screen. The vehicle continued for another 30 feet or so and then stopped. A few minutes later, it started up again and headed back to the ship. The cooks, if we were right, had just gotten their ingredients and were now heading back to prep dinner. I waited until the vibrations disappeared, then I tapped 3 more times on my microphone. Elena answered back. I began to move forward and then drove down. After a drop of about 30 feet, I turned my nose up and approached the silo from the bottom. Elena was on standby in case something went wrong. I didn't want to think about that, partly because there was no real plan B. If I got in and we were right about the silo, she'd also break in, but from the side. My digger crept closer and closer until the nose cut through the concrete floor of the dark room. The sensor on the nose cone kicked in and stopped the disruptor. I continued to drill ahead slowly, as quietly as I could, and emerged in the silo. As soon as my cockpit was above the level of the floor, I turned off the engine. I opened the latch a crack, not enough to turn on the light, and listened. There was no sound. The room was completely dark and very cold. There was the faint aroma of cooked food. I smiled. I crawled out of my cockpit and turned on my headlamp. A package of hams had caught on the disruptor. It was steaming and smelled delicious. I could hear the sizzle of the roasting ham, but nothing else. My stomach growled. But I wasn't here to eat. I was here to be the Artful Dodger. I reached back in my cockpit and turned my radio back on, tapping the mic 3 times, and then turned it off. A few moments later, the nose of Elena's digger cut through the wall to my right. Then she spun around and backed in, opening the storage area in the back of her digger. I quickly grabbed as much food and water as I could. I also grabbed the hams, stealing a small, deliciously crispy bit of grizzle before I placed them in Elena's trunk. Elena gave me a wave and then drove away slowly. My nerves were on edge, half expecting the sound of the door opening or somebody coming back because the cooks needed an extra onion. But I pushed all the fears out of my head and concentrated on covering our tracks. Luckily, the diggers didn't leave much rubble in front of them, so I just needed to disguise the holes. I slid a stack of boxes in front of the hole Elena's had made. Then I put a large crate next to my hole. I got in my digger, reversed down about 10 feet, then dug back up on an angle. Once my cockpit was even with the hole, I stopped and then flipped it open. Standing on the fuselage of the digger, I reached back into the room and grabbed the crate. I slid it as best as I could over the hole my digger had cut in the floor. I knew the holes would be found eventually, but I hoped we'd be able to stage a few more raids before that happened. I turned my radio back on and tapped it 3 times. Elena tapped twice, and I heard her give a huge sigh of relief. I turned my mic off and we headed away. About 5 minutes into the return journey, I noticed a red blip on my screen, a warning signal. It hadn't been there 30 minutes before, and I was now following almost the exact same path from the food depot. As I watched, the red blip became more constant and brighter. My screen was now showing at least 30 red blips, all from the same place. Had I stumbled on my dad's warning beacon? This was too good to be true. I quickly noted the coordinates. Then the red lights shut off. I shook my head just in case I was hallucinating. How could they just disappear like that? I turned on my radio. I hoped we were far enough away from the landers that there was no way they could hear us, even if they were listening for radio transmissions, which I doubted. Still, I kept it short. Miner 3 to Miner 2. Detour. See you at home. Roger, Miner 3. Miner 2 out. There was a pause, and then I was sure she added, be careful, but it was barely a whisper. I turned off my radio and headed for the location of the blips. That many signals together could signify a tunnel that wasn't on our map, or a huge seam of volcanic rock, one it could take me an hour to drill out of without my disruptor. On the flip side, if it were my father's beacon, why did it turn on and then turn off so suddenly? I didn't want to risk plowing into it by accident before I could find out. Either way, I needed to be careful. I slowed to a crawl. The red blip started again a minute later, closer, but all together. Then they stopped again. I sped up a little and broke through the rock into an open space. The disruptor shut off and I eased into the carved rock floor. The main lights were on. I stopped the digger and hopped out. I was standing in a tunnel, a really big tunnel. It curved
away from me, about 100 yards on either side. The ceiling was a good 40 feet up. It was more like a big room, a grand hall, about twice the size of the locker room in the basement under our building. Was this supposed to be the foundation for another core scraper? A storage locker for more ore? A regular clicking sound started echoing from somewhere up ahead around the turn. The signals were firing again. I listened for a few seconds, walking slowly toward the sound. I turned the corner and stopped. At the end of the hall, about 10 feet away from where I stood, was a huge steel cage. It was made from the same material as the cage storage locker in my basement, but this went from the floor to the ceiling. The closet wall was lined with bunk beds, and on each bed was a kid. I counted 4 as I crept up slowly. The children's eyes were closed. They were dirty. They looked sick. More than a few looked like they might be on the verge of starvation or dehydration. One boy's chest was barely rising and falling, his arms draped over the side of the bed, dangling and motionless. I reached the cage and saw one of the beds was empty. The clicking noise resumed, and it was coming from near my feet. I looked down. A girl about my age was lying on the floor, leaning against the locked gate of the cage. Her eyes were barely open, and her lips looked so parched. I thought they might crack. She was holding on to a long rope. It was made of slits of fabric that had been ripped from sheet and then tied together. A hook on the end, made from a pair of glasses, was caught in a box. She caught the box and then dragged it toward her. I got on my knees and examined the contents. It was filled with small red discs. They were blinking, clicking, and then shutting off. I touched the girl's hand. It was freezing cold. "My name is Christopher Nichols," I said. "I'm a miner." Her eyes focused on me, and in a hoarse crack, she said, "Hello, Christopher Nichols. My name is Fatima Carvalho. I am a grinder."